Now I got the mic. Oh, boy. The actor Don Murray, who was very active in the 50s and 60s and went on to produce and direct the movie The Cross and the Switchblade as a reflection of his Christian faith as well, found himself in a quandary when he was drafted to go fight in Korea, in that he realized that he was conscientiously an objector to war. His brother, who was a Marine, entirely approved of his stance because, as he said, if my brother says that's what he believes, that's what he believes. And both brothers were very supportive of each other's choices. But his draft board was very reluctant to grant him a deferment because he was so prominent as an actor. They didn't want to be seen approving of an actor, and actors have the reputation sometimes of being publicity hounds or shallow or in one way or another also opinion makers. And if he was granted a deferment, who knows who else would want to have one? But finally, because his brother stood up for him, he was granted a deferment. Now the problem was, where was he going to serve? The Mennonites and the Quakers rejected him because he drank and smoked. But the brethren said, oh, well, we're all imperfect anyway. So he went to serve in Europe for 2 years as a member of Brethren Volunteer Service. Don Murray was sent to a refugee camp. By this point in the 50s, there were still many people who had been displaced during World War II who had not yet found a place to live. In many cases, their homelands no longer existed or were under communist rule. It was very difficult. So he began, and he was so taken with the people who he worked with in the refugee camp that he began to buy farmland in Sicily. So there would be a place for some of the people that he worked with to be trained as farmers, and if they chose to begin to purchase and own the land that they were farming. Indeed, this became an example to others on how to relocate and educate people. And he put his money where his mouth was. So his time in Brethren Volunteer Service proved to be a life changer for him. And he joined the Church of the Brethren, and he's still a member to this day. Last I checked, he's still alive. Talked to him some years ago. Anyway, 1956, a few years later, it's a presidential year, and he is involved in the campaign of Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee for president. Adlai Stevenson's campaign is not going well, and at one point, Don Murray is assigned to introduce at an obscure rally the vice presidential candidate. Can anybody here remember who was the vice presidential candidate with Adlai Stevenson? Let me give you a hint. It begins with C. Estes Kefauver. Did that name pop in your head at all? Okay. Yeah, we don't remember failed vice presidential candidates very well, do we? So he was supposed to introduce him, but his plane was delayed. And there were all these people there for the rally, so they told Don Murray, why don't you go up there and tell some Hollywood stories? He had acted with Marilyn Monroe and many other famous actors of the day. They thought that would entertain the crowd. But he didn't want to talk about his life in Hollywood in the movies. Instead, he got up and began to talk about Brethren Volunteer Service and what it was like to work for next to nothing in order to help make a change in not only the lives of those you serve, but in your own life as well. One of those in the audience was a senator, Hubert Humphrey. And even though that presidential campaign failed in 1956 and Dwight D. Eisenhower was reelected, Hubert Humphrey went to Dwight D. Eisenhower and said, we ought to do something so that young Americans can go overseas for 2 years and serve other people and be served. Well, Eisenhower was fascinated, but he said, we'll never get it through Congress. So Hubert Humphrey held on to that idea, and 4 years later, when John F. Kennedy was elected, he told them about that speech again. And Kennedy said, we'll never get it through Congress, so I'll just sign an executive order. And that's how the Peace Corps was founded. The original intent was to bring in the Brethren guy whose name slips my mind, who was running the program, Brethren Volunteer Service. But he didn't want to leave his job, so they brought in Sergeant Shriver. But it's an example of how our little tiny denomination made a huge difference, because to this day, people are working in the Peace Corps and they're working in Brethren Volunteer Service. You know, most brethren aren't aware of just what an amazing influence we have had as a small denomination. Instead, we just think about the fights we're having among each other, about things that won't matter in 20 years. And the reason I know this is everything we argue and fight about, like every other denomination, doesn't matter 20 years later. Whatever that big issue is, disappears. But we tend to focus on that instead of what God has used us for. Because we start to name ourselves, and in whatever way we name ourselves, we're not good enough. In this scripture, God says, I have great things for you to do, Jeremiah. So don't tell me you're too young. And we don't know if by that we mean he was too young, literally, or too inexperienced, or what he meant. But it's obvious Jeremiah is saying, I'm not up to this task. And God says, we're going to pluck up nations. We're going to build a new people. You remember, Jeremiah is the one who is going to say, thus says the Lord, I am going to create a new covenant. I am going to write my law on your heart so you will not need to study it. You're going to know right from wrong. He is going to remind the people that we can't count on our earthly institutions, but we can count on God to create in us an eternal people. But Jeremiah, like a lot of us as individuals and churches and denominations, already know the reasons that we can't do it. We see ourselves not as eternal creatures of light and glory. C.S. Lewis once said that if we could see ourselves as heaven sees us, we would be tempted to bow down and worship each other, because as he said, we have never met a mere mortal. Every one of us is a creature of glory, shielded from each other by the temporary housing that God has given us in our bodies. But we are magnificent. But instead we say, oh, it's just me. I can't do anything. If, as I said, if Jeremiah could see himself, he would realize what we know now about him, that he is a great prophet. If we could see our church as God sees us, we might look at ourselves differently. And so, since I have been struggling with my voice all this week, since I'm on antibiotics and steroids, since I decided to take the opportunity of these wonderfully freezing days to just get really sick, I decided that 13 minutes of my message is going to be done for me by the Church of the Brethren. You're going to watch a little video here, and I'll just say one or two things afterwards, but I think it speaks for itself about the little church. This is really a wonderful thing. It was shown at annual conference last year, and it's a good thing for Service Sunday. All righty, I'll put you guys in charge there.
Once upon a time, there was a church. It wasn't a big church. It wasn't even a medium-sized church. Most people called it small. But this church had big ideas. A while ago, the church noticed that disasters were especially hard on children. The Not So Big Church had an idea to offer pop-up child care centers right beside the disasters, where parents were dealing with paperwork and putting their lives back together. Specially trained volunteers made a place for children to be children, to play, to feel safe. The church kept this up for years, training people all across the country, even as far away as Hawaii. Then there came a time when there were so many disasters that lots of these volunteers were needed all at once. There were 2 hurricanes, wildfires, floods, a volcano, a train crash, a horrific shooting. In just 1 year, there were 17 disasters that needed childcare volunteers. But the church was ready for such a time as this. Those 2 hurricanes blew through the Caribbean, and Maria hit especially hard on the island of Puerto Rico, one of the 24 districts of this not-so-big church. Some people lost homes. Everyone lost power. The church sent people to help with the recovery and shipped a container load of supplies. It had been 70 years since the first congregation was established there, and relationships have grown over generations. Remember the beginning of the work in South Sudan? The not-so-big church went there long before there was even a country called South Sudan. The ministry builds up the church presence there, responds to human need, and works for peace and reconciliation. It's been some of the hardest work the church has done, but today there's a peace center in Torit. This not-so-big church has a sister church in Nigeria. These brothers and sisters have suffered greatly because of Boko Haram. Many people have died. Some were kidnapped. Buildings were burned. The church in the U.S. sent people and food and money. The church also invited organizations in Washington to meet with leaders from the Nigerian church. By working together, they could make their voice bigger. When these organizations met with politicians, they described their connections with Nigeria. Some said, "We've been working there for 5 years." They went on around the table. And then, the not-so-big church said, "We've been in Nigeria for 95 years. We built the school in Chibok." The church saw that there was devastating violence in the U.S., not just in other countries, and much of it was gun violence. So the church spoke out for peace, and many of its members took to the streets to make a public peace witness. One of the church's big ideas was to hold a conference for older adults. That was 25 years ago, and people over 50 are still heading to Lake Junaluska, North Carolina, for a week of worship and inspiration. It's a lot like National Youth Conference, except no one sits on the floor, and bedtime is a little earlier. You're never too old to grow in faith. There was a small country that the world said was no good. The not-so-big church had a big idea to help this country feed its people. Over the years, a number of church members visited North Korea to work on agriculture projects, something these folks knew well. Eventually, a couple was assigned to teach agriculture to students at a university. After a while, it became too risky for them to stay, but the church had developed a connection that spans the miles. As North Korea takes center stage in the world's attention, this church continues to pray for its people and for the possibility of peace. The not-so-big church felt rather small, but even so, it said yes to a request from the people in the faraway countries of Rwanda, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The people in the Great Lakes region of Africa had heard of the church's peace-building work, and that is what they needed. Now, several years later, this mission work includes trauma healing, soybean growing, and church planting. It's what the church calls a holistic gospel. The Great Lakes region is far away, but not too far away for a young adult work camp to go to Burundi. The previous year, young adults went to Nepal. And in a host of work camps all across the U.S., junior and senior high school students serve and grow in faith. One of the church's big ideas was a volunteer program that sent people across the country and around the world to spend a year, sometimes more, sharing God's love in acts of service. Brethren Volunteer Service just turned 70 years old, and now some 7,000 people have passed through its doors, giving, but also receiving. Sure, they are helping others, but the volunteers are changed too. Sometimes ideas start small and then get big. The not-so-big church planted congregations in the Dominican Republic. Then people from that church moved to Spain and started a fellowship there. And then people from that church in Spain started another one in London. More than 300 years after the Brethren movement began in Germany, new seeds are being planted again in Europe. Dominicans also took the church to Venezuela. How will that grow? Right now, the mission work involves worship and education. There's been a feet washing service and baptisms. The political situation in Venezuela is tense, and there are plenty of opportunities for a peace church to make a witness. The not-so-big church was growing in some parts of the world, but it felt fragile in the United States. Members worried about their disagreements and wondered what their future was. So the General Secretary visited every district to listen to people. The church decided to work together on a vision that would unite them. The church magazine doubled the number of different writers contributing to its pages. The church got together at its annual meeting because talking and worshiping together seemed like a good idea. The church worked at listening to people of color in their midst, recognizing that it can be difficult for them to feel comfortable in a church that's predominantly white. The church recognized that some of the big ideas written in church papers hadn't gotten very far, but determined to keep trying. But the growing edges of this not-so-big church are interracial, and that was celebrated at New and Renew, a conference on church revitalization and church planting. The conference was planned and led by a volunteer committee that represented these areas of growth. In a not-so-big church, publishing Sunday school materials is definitely a big idea. Many larger churches have decided they can't afford it anymore. But this church's children's curriculum, called Shine, Living in God's Light, is holding its own and even growing into other denominations. One customer called to say that Shine had gotten a shout-out in a Presbyterian webinar. "Shine is the best," she said. Sharing food is one of the ways this not-so-big church shows God's love. This church helps develop community gardens in congregations across the country and in many places around the world. It's continuing the work of Jesus, who had compassion for the hungry and fed the multitudes. Who is this small church with big ideas?
Well, my guess is everybody here learned at least a little something by watching that, but that's just part of our story. I know I used to annoy people in Everett, Pennsylvania, because if I was asked to pray before the crop walk, I would remind them that crop was founded by the Church of the Brethren. If there was a Church World Service program, I would remind them that Church World Service was founded by the Church of the Brethren. And, of course, Heifer International, which so many denominations think they founded, was founded by us as well. So it's a tremendous story. Jeremiah has his excuse at the start of the message: I'm just too small. But plenty of people are willing to put us down too, or other people, other denominations down, whatever the denomination is. When Jesus speaks in his hometown, the people say, "Isn't this the carpenter's son? Aren't his brothers and sisters here among us?" As if to say he can't be somebody because he's one of us. People are ready to tell us why the church in general is not going to be very effective anymore. And yet God is not done working great things in the world, and neither should we be. We serve an awesome God, or we serve a God who is limited by our own limitations. And I've got a feeling that most of us would subscribe to the awesome God theory. And it's true that it is a very difficult world, that there are no easy answers, but our response, as you began to share at the beginning of worship, is the love of God. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful. It is not arrogant or rude. Love does not insist on its own way. It does not rejoice in the wrong, but rejoices in the right. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for knowledge, it will pass away, and as for tongues, they will cease, and as for prophecy, it will pass away. But faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. God's message to us today is a message of faith, hope, and especially love as we struggle with our spiritual, physical, emotional limitations as individuals, as a congregation, as a denomination, as the Christian body of Christ here and throughout the world. Let us remember that God is not deterred, and that the scriptures tell us that although the path is difficult, the way is clear, and the way is the way of love.